It was one of those long days that seemed to stretch forever. The kind of day when the clock moved slower, and even a cup of coffee couldn't bring enough energy to stay awake. After spending more than 10 hours at the hospital, tending to patients and rushing between rooms, she finally got to leave. Her white uniform smelled faintly of antiseptic, and her shoulders felt heavy from carrying the day's weight. The sun was already sinking low, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and gold. She rolled down her car window, hoping the evening air would wake her up a little. All she wanted now was a warm meal and a few hours of quiet. She had no idea that her drive home that day would change everything, not just for her, but for someone powerful and his little boy. Halfway through the highway, she noticed her car's fuel light blinking. With a sigh, she turned into a nearby gas station. It wasn't a big one, just a small stop with a single row of pumps and a corner shop that sold snacks, coffee, and soda. She parked beside one of the pumps and stretched her stiff arms. As she filled her tank, she thought about calling her mother once she got home. It had been a while since they talked properly. She went inside the shop to grab a coffee. The man at the counter smiled politely, recognizing her from her usual stops after work. She thanked him, took her cup, and stepped outside, inhaling the cool air. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. The hum of cars, the rustle of trees nearby, and the faint scent of rain in the wind. She leaned against her car and took her first sip. Then it happened. The sound came first, a long screech of tires followed by a deafening crash that shattered the calm. Her coffee slipped from her hand, spilling across the concrete. She turned toward the highway and saw smoke rising in the distance, thick and dark. A few people at the station gasped, pointing toward the source of the noise. Without a thought, she dropped her bag on the seat and started running. Her heart raced faster than her feet could move. As she neared the crash site, the heat hit her face. A large black SUV had collided with the divider, the front crushed in flames licking under the hood. The smell of burning fuel filled the air, sharp and terrifying. A few cars had stopped on the side of the road and people stood frozen, unsure what to do. She could hear the faint sound of someone crying inside the vehicle. She shouted, asking if anyone was inside, but no one answered. Then she saw movement in the back seat. A small figure struggling and crying. It was a child. She ran closer, ignoring the growing flames. "There's a baby!" she yelled to the bystanders. But no one moved. Some shouted for her to stop, saying the car could explode any second. She didn't listen. The cries were too desperate, too scared. She knew that sound. She had heard it in hospital emergency rooms from people holding on to life. Her hands shook as she reached for the door handle. It was locked. She pulled, then tried again, but it wouldn't budge. The glass was already hot to the touch. She stepped back, looked around, and spotted a small metal rod near the road, maybe part of another car's debris. Grabbing it, she swung hard against the rear window. Once, twice, and the glass cracked but didn't shatter. Her heart pounded louder than the fire crackling nearby. With one final hit, the glass gave way. She used her elbow to clear the remaining shards and crawled halfway inside. Smoke burned her throat as she coughed and blinked through tears. The boy, no more than 3 years old, was strapped in a car seat, his cheeks streaked with soot and tears. "It's okay, baby. I've got you," she said, her voice hoarse but calm. She fumbled with the seatbelt clip, her fingers trembling. It was jammed. The fire was growing louder, a harsh roar mixed with popping sounds from the engine. She could feel the heat pushing against her back. Her mind screamed to hurry. Finally, the buckle gave way and she pulled the boy into her arms. He clung to her neck tightly, his tiny hands shaking. She tried to back out through the window but got caught on a sharp piece of metal. She yanked herself free, cutting her arm but not caring. Just as she stumbled away from the car, there was a loud bang. Part of the hood burst open in flames. The heat was unbearable, and she shielded the boy with her body, covering his face from the sparks flying through the air. People nearby screamed and ran back. She fell to her knees, gasping for air, holding the crying child close. For a moment, everything felt distant. The world around her blurred, the flames, the noise, the people shouting. All she could hear was the boy's heartbeat against her chest. He was safe. That was all that mattered. Someone from the crowd rushed forward with a blanket and water bottle. Another man called emergency services, his hands shaking as he spoke into the phone. She looked down at the little boy in her arms, his eyes wide but alive. "You're safe now," she whispered, brushing ash from his hair. The sound of sirens grew louder in the distance. Police, firefighters, and an ambulance rushing toward the scene. Paramedics jumped out, and one of them took the child carefully from her arms. She stood there, covered in soot, her arm bleeding lightly from the cut, still catching her breath. As firefighters battled the burning vehicle, one of the officers came over and asked if she was okay. She nodded slowly, still dazed. "He was alone in the car?" she asked. The officer shook his head. His father was in another car. They were driving together. He stopped behind the accident. She turned her head slightly, trying to see through the flashing lights and smoke. A line of expensive cars had pulled up near the wreck. One of the men who stepped out looked different. Tall, well-dressed, his face pale as he scanned the scene. He pushed past the officers and ran toward the ambulance where the boy was being checked. She couldn't hear their words, but she saw the man fall to his knees beside his son, holding him tight. A few people began recording on their phones, the fire, the rescue, the reunion. She looked away, feeling awkward being part of something that suddenly seemed much bigger than her. A paramedic asked her to sit down while they cleaned her arm. She refused at first, saying she was fine, but the nurse inside her knew she wasn't thinking straight, so she sat quietly on the roadside curb, still watching the boy from a distance. He had stopped crying now, sipping water from a small cup. Minutes passed like hours. Someone handed her a wet towel to clean her face. The police took her brief statement, how she saw the crash, what she did, how she got the boy out. She answered calmly, though her voice trembled a little. She didn't even notice when reporters began arriving with cameras filming everything. When she finally stood to leave, her coffee cup still lay shattered back at the gas station. Her hands were blackened with ash, her sleeves torn, her arm wrapped with a small bandage. She felt strangely calm, almost empty. The adrenaline that had carried her through the moment was fading, replaced by quiet exhaustion. Before she could walk back to her car, she heard someone calling out. It was the man from earlier, the boy's father. He was surrounded by bodyguards and police officers, but he stepped forward alone. His face was still pale, his eyes red from tears. He stopped in front of her, looking at her like he didn't quite believe she was real. "You saved my son," he said softly, his voice breaking. She didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to being thanked like that. She just smiled faintly and said, "I'm glad he's okay." He tried to speak again, but his voice caught in his throat. All he could do was nod, pressing a hand to his chest as if trying to steady his heart. Reporters stood nearby, cameras flashing, capturing every moment, but she didn't care. She only wanted to go home, take a shower, and forget the smell of burning fuel that still clung to her hair. As she walked back toward the gas station, the man stayed there, watching her leave with his son in his arms. Neither of them knew that this moment, this simple act of courage, would soon travel around the world. At that moment, it wasn't about fame or recognition. It was just about a woman who saw a child in danger and chose to run toward the fire when everyone else stepped back. And though she didn't yet know it, that one decision was about to change both of their lives forever. The next morning, the story was everywhere. It was on the news, in every social media feed, and even on talk shows. The headline read something like, "Unknown nurse risks life to save toddler from burning car." There was a photo taken by someone at the scene, her sitting on the ground with her face blackened by smoke, holding the little boy in her arms. The image was powerful. It showed fear, strength, and love all in one frame. But she didn't know any of that yet. She woke up late, her body sore and her throat raw from the smoke she had inhaled. For a few seconds after opening her eyes, everything felt quiet and normal. Then the memories came rushing back. The flames, the child's cries, the sound of the explosion behind her. She sat up in bed, her heart thudding as if she were still there. The small apartment she lived in felt extra silent that morning. She made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, looking out at the city waking up. For her, it felt strange. Just a few hours ago, she had faced death up close. But now everything outside looked ordinary. Cars passing by, people heading to work, birds sitting on electric wires. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was her friend from the hospital. "Turn on the TV," the message said. When she did, she froze. Her face filled the screen. The reporter was talking about her act of bravery. The anchor called her the woman who ran into fire when others ran away. They showed the video clips recorded by witnesses, the burning SUV, her breaking the window, carrying the child out. People online were calling her a hero. Her phone started ringing nonstop. Some calls were from her colleagues, others from unknown numbers. She didn't answer most of them. It all felt unreal. She hadn't done it for attention or praise. She had just seen a child in danger and reacted. By afternoon, she finally stepped outside to buy groceries. The moment she entered the small store near her apartment, the cashier smiled widely. "You're the woman from the news, right? You saved that kid?" She hesitated, almost embarrassed. "I guess that was me," she said softly. The man looked amazed. "You're a real hero. Everyone's talking about it." She smiled politely, but inside she felt awkward. She didn't feel like a hero. She had cuts on her arm, her body still ached, and her uniform from yesterday was ruined. Heroes, she thought, were supposed to feel proud. She just felt tired. Later that evening, when she came home, she noticed a black car parked near her building. Two men in formal suits stepped out as she approached. For a moment, she got nervous, thinking maybe they were from the police or reporters. But one of them smiled kindly and introduced himself as part of a private security team. "Our employer wishes to meet you," he said politely. "If you're comfortable, he'd like to thank you in person." She frowned slightly. "Who's your employer?" "Mr. Alexander Grant," the man said. "He's the father of the child you rescued." She froze for a moment. She had heard that name before. Everyone had. He was one of the country's most powerful businessmen, a billionaire known for his companies, investments, and quiet lifestyle. She remembered seeing him once on television during a charity event. She didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to avoid the attention, but another part knew it was right to at least meet him. So she agreed. The men nodded and offered to drive her. She hesitated, but eventually got into the car. The ride was quiet. The city lights blurred past the window as they drove toward the upper side of town, where large houses stood behind tall iron gates. Finally, they stopped in front of a mansion that looked more like a private museum than a home. The gate opened automatically as the car approached. When she stepped out, the cool evening breeze brushed her face. Everything around her was silent. The neatly trimmed gardens, the soft lights, the calm sound of water from a fountain nearby. One of the guards led her to the front door. Inside, the place was huge yet simple. No unnecessary luxury, just quiet elegance. A man stood near the large window overlooking the garden. When he turned around, she recognized him from the news. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly, his voice calm but filled with emotion. He looked different from how he appeared in the media. There, he always looked confident, composed, unreachable, but now his eyes were softer and there were faint shadows beneath them, as if he hadn't slept properly. "You must be the nurse who saved my son," he said, stepping forward. "I don't even know how to begin thanking you." She gave a small smile. "I just did what I could. I'm glad he's okay." He paused, as if trying to find words that could match what he felt. "You didn't just help him. You saved his life. The doctors told me he had only minutes before the car would have been completely engulfed." She looked down, trying to brush it off. "Anyone would have done the same." He shook his head. No one else ran toward the fire. They all stood there. "You didn't think about yourself, and that's something I'll never forget." There was silence between them for a few seconds. Then he motioned toward a side door. "Would you like to see him?" Her eyes lit up a little. "He's here?" He nodded. "The hospital said he was stable enough to come home this afternoon. He's been asking for you." She followed him into a large living room where a woman sat on the couch with the little boy in her lap. The boy's face brightened when he saw her. "You're the lady from the car," he said in a tiny, excited voice. She knelt down, smiling. "Hey there. How are you feeling?" He giggled and showed her a small toy truck. "It's new. Daddy got it for me." "That's a nice one," she said gently, touching his hair. The woman beside him smiled warmly. "He hasn't stopped talking about you all day." For the first time since the accident, she felt a sense of relief deep inside her chest. The boy was smiling, alive, and full of energy. The image of him crying inside that car had haunted her dreams, but seeing him like this made it all worth it. As she stood to leave, Alexander stopped her. "Please wait," he said. "I want to do something for you." She shook her head quickly. "That's not necessary, really." He looked at her, almost hurt by her refusal. "You don't understand. You gave me back my son. There's no gift that could ever repay that, but I have to try." "I didn't do it for a reward," she said softly. "I just did what I had to." He smiled faintly. "That's exactly why I want to help you." She didn't argue further. She just nodded politely and thanked him again before leaving. That night, she went home feeling strange again. It wasn't the attention or the money. It was the human side of it all. She had seen one of the most powerful men in the country break down and speak like any ordinary father. It reminded her that no matter how high people rise, fear and love make everyone equal in moments like that. The next morning, things took another turn. Her story had gone completely viral. The video of Alexander thanking her at the accident site was being shared everywhere. Millions of people were commenting, calling it one of the most emotional moments ever caught on camera. Some were even comparing it to movie scenes. But what truly surprised her was what came next. Later that afternoon, while she was at the hospital, one of her coworkers ran up to her, holding her phone. "Have you seen this?" On the screen was a video of Alexander speaking at a press conference. Behind him were reporters, cameras, and the hospital's logo. His voice was calm but emotional as he said, "There are moments in life that remind us what truly matters: compassion, bravery, and selflessness. A woman I barely knew saved my child yesterday. She risked her life for a stranger's son. Because of her, I still have my family." He paused for a moment, then added, "To honor her courage, I am donating $2 million to this hospital. Where she serves with such dedication, we will build a new pediatric wing and name it after her." The crowd erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. Her coworkers turned to her stunned. She stood there speechless, tears forming in her eyes. The next few days were a blur. Reporters waited outside the hospital to interview her. People she had never met sent flowers and letters of gratitude. Children drew pictures of her saving the boy and mailed them to her department. She was overwhelmed, not by fame but by kindness. But the most touching moment came when she received a small handwritten note a week later. It was from Alexander himself. The letter said simply, "You taught me something I had forgotten, that real power is not in wealth but in humanity. Thank you for saving my son, and for reminding the world that kindness still exists." She folded the letter carefully and kept it inside her diary. That night, she sat by her window again, watching the city lights flicker below. The noise of the world seemed far away. She thought about how one moment, one decision to run toward danger, had changed everything. She didn't see herself as a hero. She still saw herself as the same nurse who cared for people quietly, one patient at a time. But now she understood something deeper. Sometimes, even ordinary people become part of extraordinary stories. Not because they plan to, but because their heart simply refuses to walk away when someone needs help. And somewhere across town, a powerful man sat beside his sleeping son, silently thanking the woman who had reminded him that even in a world full of noise, humanity could still shine the brightest. The days that followed were nothing like anything she had ever experienced. Her quiet life had suddenly turned into something she couldn't quite recognize. Everywhere she went, people seemed to know her. Strangers smiled at her in coffee shops, calling her the brave nurse. Her story had spread beyond the country, reaching people overseas who had watched the viral video of the rescue and the billionaire's public gratitude. At first, she didn't know how to feel about it. She had never wanted attention. She preferred small moments, caring for patients, listening to their stories, walking home after long shifts. But now, every time she entered the hospital, people would stop and whisper. Some wanted pictures with her. Others simply wanted to shake her hand. Her colleagues teased her kindly, saying, "You're famous now. Don't forget us when Hollywood calls." She laughed it off, but deep down she missed the normal days. She didn't want to be known as a hero. She wanted to go back to being just another nurse trying to make a difference in small ways. But things were already changing faster than she could control. One afternoon, as she was preparing medicine for a patient, the hospital director called her to his office. When she walked in, she found a few people from the media waiting with cameras and microphones. She froze at the sight. The director smiled and said, "They're here for a small interview about the new pediatric wing. Mr. Grant wanted them to highlight your story as part of the hospital's development." She felt her stomach twist. She didn't like speaking in front of cameras, but it was already happening. The journalist asked questions, how she felt that day, what went through her mind if she realized whose child she had saved. She answered calmly, keeping her words simple. "I didn't think about anything. I just saw a child in trouble," she said, just as she had said before. The interview aired that night. People praised her honesty and humility even more. But while the world celebrated her, she began feeling the weight of constant attention. Some nights she stayed awake, wondering if people would ever stop seeing her as a headline. A week later, her phone rang again. It was a familiar voice, a Mr. Grant. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said politely. "I wanted to ask if you'd join us for the opening ceremony of the new wing next month. It would mean a lot if you could be there." She hesitated for a moment, then agreed. "Of course. It's for the children, right? I'll be there." His voice softened. "Yes, but it's also for you. You've inspired more people than you realize." The call was short, but his tone lingered with her long after. There was something genuine in it, not just gratitude, but a quiet connection that words didn't fully explain. In the following weeks, she continued her usual work, trying to keep things as normal as possible. Yet sometimes when she walked past the children's ward, she thought of the little boy she had saved. She wondered how he was doing, if he remembered that day or if the memory had already faded like smoke. Then one Saturday morning, she received a handwritten note delivered by courier. It was from Mr. Grant again. He had written, "We're having a small gathering at the foundation this weekend to discuss safety awareness and first response training. Your presence would make a real difference. Please come if you can." At first, she thought about declining. Public events made her nervous. But then she remembered the purpose, helping others learn what to do in emergencies. That part felt right. So she went. The event was held at a modern glass building downtown, decorated with banners that read, "Together for Safer Lives." When she arrived, she noticed cameras, reporters, and a few familiar faces from television. Mr. Grant saw her from across the room and came over immediately, greeting her warmly. "I'm really glad you came," he said sincerely. "You've started something bigger than just one story. People are listening now. They want to learn, to act." She smiled shyly. "I didn't start anything. It was just one moment." He shook his head. "Sometimes one moment changes everything." During the event, she watched as parents, teachers, and first responders discussed how to react during accidents, how to use fire extinguishers, and how to stay calm under pressure. It was inspiring to see people learning because of what had happened that day. After the speeches, as the crowd began to leave, she and Mr. Grant found themselves standing by the large window overlooking the city. The evening light reflected softly on the glass walls. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then he said quietly, "You know, I used to think success was about building things and companies, wealth, power. But that day, when I saw you holding my son in your arms, I realized how fragile everything really is." She looked at him thoughtfully. "Maybe we all need something to remind us what really matters." He nodded slowly. "You reminded me." Their eyes met for a moment, not in a romantic way, but in a deeply human one. The kind that happens when two people share an understanding that words can't quite express. That night, after returning home, she sat on her bed with her phone lighting up from countless notifications. Her story had once again made headlines after the event. But among all the noise, there was one message that caught her attention. It was from an unknown number. It read, "You don't know me, but my sister was in an accident last year. Watching your story gave me courage to keep helping others. Thank you for reminding me that one person's kindness can save more than one life." She stared at the message for a long time. Then she smiled. Maybe this was the true purpose of everything that had happened. Not the fame, not the recognition, but the quiet ripple effect of hope it had created in people's hearts. As the days passed, she and Mr. Grant stayed in touch, mostly about the foundation's work. They met occasionally for meetings and community programs. Every time he spoke less like a businessman and more like someone trying to make a difference. It surprised her how much he had changed since that first day. One afternoon after a meeting, he said, "You know, I used to believe that gratitude was something you showed once, like saying thank you and moving on. But after meeting you, I realized gratitude is something you live by. It changes how you see people." She smiled at that. "Maybe we both learned something." He nodded. "Yes, you taught me courage. My son calls you his guardian angel." She laughed softly. "He's a sweet kid. I'm glad he's doing well." "He still keeps that toy truck you gave him," he said with a small grin. "He says it's lucky." Hearing that made her heart warm. It was such a small gesture, giving him that toy when he was scared in the hospital, but somehow it meant something to him. In the months that followed, life slowly found its balance again. The excitement around her story began to settle down, though people still remembered her name. The hospital's new pediatric wing was built faster than expected. When it was finished, she stood quietly at the back during the ribbon-cutting ceremony, trying not to draw attention. But Mr. Grant spotted her from the stage and invited her forward. When she joined him, he turned to the audience and said, "This building is not just made of walls and equipment. It's built on a moment of courage that reminded us all what humanity looks like." The crowd applauded as he gestured toward her. She blushed, trying to hide her nervous smile. The cameras flashed again, but this time she didn't mind. She realized this wasn't about her anymore. It was about what people could do when they acted out of love and compassion. After the event, as people mingled and talked, the little boy ran up to her and held her hand. "Daddy says you're brave," he said proudly. "But I think you're magic." She laughed and squeezed his hand gently. "Maybe we're both a little bit magic," she said. That evening, she walked out of the hospital and stood under the fading sunset. The world around her felt peaceful again. She had gone from being a tired nurse to someone who had unknowingly inspired millions, and yet, she still felt like the same person. She thought about how life could change in a single second. One choice, one heartbeat, one act of courage. She hadn't done it for attention or praise. She had done it because it was right. And now, as the cool wind brushed her face, she felt a sense of quiet fulfillment. Her story had become more than an event. It had become a reminder that kindness, no matter how small, could light up even the darkest moments. Somewhere, she knew, people were still watching that old video, the one of her running toward the burning car. But she didn't see herself as a hero in it. She saw a person who listened to her heart, who didn't think twice when life asked her to act. As she drove home that night, the radio played softly in the background. The news anchor mentioned her name once more, talking about the hospital's new wing and the lives it would save. She smiled faintly, shook her head, and turned the volume down. It was time to let the noise fade, to return to the quiet rhythm of her life. But deep down she knew that her story, their story, would keep living on. Not through fame or headlines, but in the unseen ways people would find courage when they needed it most. And as the city lights twinkled outside her car window, she whispered to herself, "Sometimes the smallest act of bravery can echo forever." When the story of the highway rescue hit the internet, no one expected it to spread as fast as it did. Within hours, short clips filmed by people at the scene were everywhere, on news channels, social media feeds, and even international broadcasts. The image that stood out most was of the young nurse, her face covered in soot, cradling the little boy in her arms while the car burned behind them. People didn't know her name yet, but they called her the woman in blue scrubs. By the next morning, everyone knew her name. Journalists found out who she was and started camping outside her small apartment. Emily, who had always lived a quiet and simple life, woke up to dozens of messages and calls. Her hospital co-workers congratulated her, and patients' families came to thank her in person. Still, she didn't feel like a hero. She told everyone she just did what anyone would have done. But somewhere else, in a glass-walled office on the top floor of a tall building, another person couldn't stop thinking about her, the man whose son she had saved. Alexander Grant had spent the entire night replaying that moment in his mind. He saw the crash again, the smoke, and then her, running straight into the flames without hesitation. He'd tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw his son's small face covered in soot and her shaking hands as she held him close. He had lived through a lot in business. Takeovers, betrayals, massive deals. But nothing had ever made him feel as powerless as that moment on the road. The next day, Alexander's assistant told him that reporters were asking for his statement. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out the window at the city skyline and said softly, "Find her for me. I want to see her, not the media." His team moved quickly. Within a few hours, they contacted the hospital and arranged a private meeting. Emily didn't know what to expect when she was asked to come to the conference room that afternoon. She thought it might be a hospital press briefing. When she opened the door, she froze. There he was, the same man she had seen only briefly at the crash site, now standing tall in a crisp suit, his expression filled with gratitude and something deeper, almost pain. He stepped forward, his voice gentle but steady. "You saved my son's life," he said quietly. "There aren't words for what that means to me." Emily, still unsure what to say, replied, "I'm just glad he's okay. That's all that matters," but Alexander shook his head. "No," he said. You risked everything for a stranger. People talk about courage, but you showed it. The world needs to see that. He asked if she would allow him to publicly thank her. Emily hesitated. She wasn't used to attention, and the idea of cameras and crowds made her nervous. She told him she didn't want fame or gifts. All she wanted was for people to remember that kindness still mattered. Alexander smiled softly. "Then let's remind them together," he said. 2 days later, a press event was arranged. Not a grand one, but a heartfelt one. It took place at the hospital courtyard, surrounded by the doctors, nurses, and families who had gathered to honor her. The little boy, now recovering well, sat in his father's arms, holding a small bunch of white flowers. When Emily stepped up to the microphone, she didn't have a speech prepared. She just spoke from the heart. "I didn't do anything special," she began. "When I saw that child trapped, I didn't think about danger. I just thought, what if it were my family? I think deep down we all have that instinct to help. We just need to listen to it more often." The crowd fell silent, and even the reporters seemed moved. Then Alexander walked forward holding his son. He didn't take the microphone right away. Instead, he turned to Emily and did something no one expected. He knelt on one knee and looked up at her. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "You saved my entire world that day." There was a collective gasp from the crowd. Cameras clicked nonstop, but in that moment, no one cared about the fame or the spotlight. It was real. A moment of raw human emotion that people rarely saw from a man of his status. The video of that moment went viral almost instantly. It wasn't just shared. It was felt. Millions watched the powerful man kneeling in gratitude before the young nurse who had risked her life. The clip spread across the world, translated into dozens of languages, and posted under one simple caption: "Humanity still exists." Over the next few days, social media flooded with messages of appreciation and stories of kindness. People began using a new hashtag, now Be Like Emily, to share small acts of good they had done. Some paid for strangers' meals, others helped the elderly cross streets, and thousands donated to emergency aid groups. It became a wave of kindness that no one had expected. Emily tried to stay out of the spotlight, but her hospital quickly noticed how the movement was inspiring people. Donations started pouring in from all over the country. Many wrote that they wanted to help the hospital where the brave nurse worked. Then Alexander made another announcement. In a public statement, he revealed that he would donate $2 million to the hospital to build a new children's wing, and he insisted it be named after Emily. When she heard the news, Emily was stunned. She didn't know how to react. That evening, she called him privately. "You don't need to do that," she said softly. "You've already said thank you." "That's enough," but he replied, "No, it's not about money. It's about honoring what you stood for that day. If this helps save more lives, then it's the best way to say thank you." His words touched her deeply. She realized he wasn't doing it out of obligation, but from genuine gratitude. The following week, construction plans were announced, and the hospital staff celebrated the project. Reporters covered every detail, not because it involved a billionaire, but because it started with one selfless act by a nurse who had no idea her story would touch the world. Despite the attention, Emily continued her normal routine. She still worked long shifts, cared for patients, and went home to her modest apartment. She didn't let fame change her. Her friends noticed she remained the same, humble, kind, and calm. Meanwhile, Alexander's public image began to change. Known for being strict and business-minded, he suddenly became a symbol of compassion and humanity. People admired not only his wealth but his humility. The moment he knelt in front of the woman who saved his son had reshaped how the world saw him. For the first time in years, Alexander started spending more time with his family. The accident had shaken him deeply. He realized how fragile life could be, and he wanted to give more time to the people who mattered most. One evening, a few weeks after the event, he invited Emily to visit his family. She hesitated at first, unsure if she should go, but finally agreed. When she arrived, his son ran up to her, smiling brightly. He handed her a small drawing. It showed a stick-figure woman pulling a small child from a fiery car. On top, in messy handwriting, it said, "Thank you for saving me." Emily couldn't hold back her tears. She knelt and hugged the boy tightly. Alexander watched quietly, his eyes filled with emotion. It was a simple moment, but it meant more than any headline or donation ever could. As the evening went on, They talked about life, fear, and the strange way fate had brought them together. Alexander told her that before the accident, he had been focused only on his work and had almost forgotten what truly mattered. That day reminded me, he said, that power means nothing if you can't use it to make a difference. Emily smiled gently and replied, "And sometimes the smallest act can change everything." He nodded, knowing she was right. The next day, his foundation announced a new national campaign to train ordinary citizens in emergency response. He asked Emily to lead it with him, saying that if more people knew what to do in an emergency, countless lives could be saved. At first, she didn't know if she could take on such a big role, but after thinking about it, she agreed. Not for fame, but because she wanted others to have the courage to act when it mattered most. Months passed, and the campaign became a huge success. Schools, offices, and communities joined, learning life-saving skills. Each event began with a short video of the rescue and a simple message. One act of courage can save a life. Whenever Emily looked back at that day on the highway, she still couldn't believe how much had changed, not just for her, but for so many others. She hadn't set out to be a hero. She had simply listened to the voice inside her that said, "Help." And because of that, a man who once measured success in numbers now measured it in kindness. A child got a second chance at life, and a movement of compassion spread across the world, all starting with one woman, one decision, and one burning car. The months after the rescue passed like chapters in a new book, each page filled with unexpected turns. The video of the event was still being shared online, but life for Emily slowly began to settle back into something that felt like normal. She was still working full-time at the hospital, walking the same quiet corridors she always had, but something inside her had changed. She felt more alive, more aware that even small moments could carry great meaning. The hospital's new children's wing, named after her, began construction that spring. Every day, workers could be seen setting up the framework, the sound of hammers echoing through the courtyard. The staff often joked that Emily had become their good luck charm. She always smiled and told them she didn't do anything special. But deep down, she was proud that something good had come from such a terrifying day. She had stayed in touch with Alexander and his family. It wasn't something planned, and it just happened naturally. Sometimes he'd call to ask about the hospital project or the training program they had started together. Other times it was just to check in and ask how she was doing. His tone was different now, softer and more personal. He had changed too. People noticed it. In interviews, he spoke less about Bussy, Ines, and more about community. He spent weekends visiting hospitals, schools, and rescue centers, often bringing his little boy along. He'd say it reminded him of what really mattered. One afternoon, a few months after the campaign's launch, Emily received a letter in the mail. It was from a woman she didn't know. The handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear. "My son was saved last week in a car accident. A passerby pulled him out before the fire spread. The man said he had seen your story and didn't hesitate because he remembered you. I just wanted to thank you for giving me my child back." Emily sat quietly for a long time after reading it. The letter trembled slightly in her hands. It was in that moment she realized how far her single act had reached. She wasn't famous for being brave. She was known because she reminded people to care. That night she stood on her small apartment balcony, watching the city lights. She thought about how strange life could be. One decision, 1 second, had changed everything. Not just for her, but for so many others. A few weeks later, she was invited to the opening ceremony of the new children's wing. The building stood tall and bright with a large banner reading the Carter Pediatric Center. She felt shy seeing her name there, but the hospital staff insisted she deserved it. As she walked through the shiny new halls filled with bright colors and laughter, she saw families, nurses, and children smiling. It was a place built for healing and hope. At the entrance, there was a small plaque with her name and a simple quote underneath, "One act of courage can save a life." During the ceremony, Alexander stood on stage to speak. His words were calm, genuine, and full of warmth. "This building is not just a hospital wing," he said. "It's a reminder of what one person's bravery can do. When someone chooses kindness, the world changes. Not just for one person, but for everyone who witnesses it." He turned toward Emily and added, "You didn't just save my son. You saved the part of me that had forgotten what truly matters. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to honor that." The crowd applauded, and Emily felt her heart swell with emotion. She wasn't used to attention, but in that moment she didn't feel nervous. She felt grateful. Grateful that something good had grown out of something tragic. After the event, she spent time talking with the children in the ward. Many of them knew who she was. One little girl looked up at her and said, "I want to be brave like you one day." Emily smiled, knelt down, and said softly, "You already are." Bravery isn't about running into fire. It's about caring for others when it's hard to do. The child smiled and hugged her, and that simple gesture stayed in Emily's heart long after. The campaign she and Alexander started continued to grow. It spread to other countries, inspiring people from different walks of life. Schools taught emergency response, and communities organized volunteer groups. Every time she read a new story of someone saving a stranger, she felt humbled. But despite all the attention, Emily's life remained beautifully simple. She still drove her old car, cooked the same meals, and stopped by the local park on weekends to feed the birds. Fame had come and gone, but what remained was peace, a kind that came from knowing she had made a difference. One evening, nearly a year after the rescue, Alexander invited her and a few others to a small charity dinner. It wasn't a fancy event, just a quiet gathering to thank those who had supported the foundation. When she arrived, she noticed how relaxed he looked. He wasn't the stern businessman she'd once seen on television. He was laughing with his son, greeting people with warmth, looking like a man finally at ease with life. During dinner, his little boy came and sat beside her. "Do you still have the bracelet I gave you?" he asked, his voice full of curiosity. She smiled and lifted her wrist, showing the tiny red string bracelet he'd once tied there as a thank you. "Of course," she said. "I'll never take it off." He grinned proudly and said, "Dad says you're my hero." She shook her head gently. "No," she said. "Your dad's the hero now. He's helping so many people." The boy thought for a moment, then said with a smile, "Then maybe you're both heroes." Alexander, who had overheard, looked at her and nodded slightly, as if agreeing with his son. It was a quiet moment, but it carried more meaning than any award or headline ever could. Later that night, when the guests began to leave, Alexander walked her to her car. The air was cool, and the city lights shimmered in the distance. They stood for a moment in silence before he spoke. "You know," he said softly, "before the accident, I used to believe that life was all about control. But that day I learned that sometimes the most powerful moments come from losing control, from trusting something greater than ourselves." Emily nodded. "Maybe that's what courage really is," she said. "Not being fearless, but trusting that what you're doing is right even when you're scared." He smiled faintly. "You've taught me more than you know," he said. "I'm grateful every day." As she drove home that night, Emily thought about everything that had happened. The rescue, the media storm, the foundation, the hospital. But what she remembered most clearly wasn't the fire or the fame. It was the child's hand reaching out to her through the smoke. And the moment she realized she couldn't just stand by and watch, that image stayed with her forever, not as a memory of danger, but as a reminder of what people are capable of when they listen to their hearts. Years later, the world continued to remember her story. Documentaries were made, books written, and speeches given, but Emily herself stayed away from the spotlight. She always said that the story didn't belong to her. It belonged to everyone who chose to act when it mattered. The foundation grew into a large international organization, helping thousands of people in disasters, accidents, and emergencies. And at every event there was a photo on display, a single frame of that day on the highway, with the caption, "One act of kindness can start a movement." As for Emily, she continued to live a quiet, meaningful life. Sometimes when she walked past the children's wing of the hospital, she'd hear laughter echoing through the halls and feel a deep sense of peace. She had never asked for recognition. She never sought reward. But she had found something far greater: purpose. The story that began with a burning car ended with healing, compassion, and a reminder that humanity still shines brightest in the darkest moments. And somewhere in that truth was the reason her story touched the world. Because it wasn't just about a nurse or a billionaire. It was about every person who has ever looked at a stranger in need and thought, I can help. It was about the power of one decision, one heartbeat, one brave step forward. And though time passed and the headlines faded, the message remained that one act of courage can light a spark that keeps the world warm for years to come.